Hi guys, and welcome to our Fireside Chat. My name's Kimberly, and I'm a Specialist Security Architect here at AWS ASEAN. And joining me today is actually an old colleague of mine, Shannon Murphy, who's currently a CTO at Hyphen Group. Shannon, could you just introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit about your career and how you've now joined Hyphen Group?
Sure. I don't want to go back way into the misty past, but I started off as my professional career as a Hungarian interpreter, working for the United States Air Force. So I don't know how I got from that into computing, but I did. I ended up creating the first internet service provider in Northern California, north of San Francisco. I started a couple of consulting companies. Then I realized I had to make money for a living, so I joined the corporate world. Went from there, became the CTO for ING Insurance, working out of Hong Kong, then the CTO for Axis Insurance, working out of New York and Singapore, and then the CTO for AIG, worked from 2013. And then something funny happened. Around 2014, we started our first big cloud projects, and I realized I was obsolete. I realized that everything I had been doing up to that point was kind of being made obsolete by the cloud and what we did on the cloud. So I decided I needed to make a change. It took me a couple of years, but I ended up working for Amazon Web Services, which is where we met.
Yeah.
I was the head of technology for financial services in Southeast Asia, met a lot of great people and learned a lot of good things. When I was ready to move on and do the whole thing, I went to Hyphen Group, who's kind of an emerging fintech company in Southeast Asia.
Awesome. So at AWS, we love our customers. Could you tell me a little bit more about what Hyphen Group does?
Sure. In a word, we are a financial marketplace and a financial fintech company in Southeast Asia. We provide services to around 10 to 12 million unique visitors per month. We reach out to about 2 to 4 million people through email and other interactive channels per month. That translates into being one of the biggest let's call it financial advisor, financial comparison businesses in Southeast Asia. We have a family of brands. We are a portfolio holder of brands such as, you may have heard of them, such as SingSaver in Singapore. Yep. Money Hero in Hong Kong, Money Max in the Philippines, Compare Hero in Malaysia, Money Guru in Thailand, and Money 101 in Taiwan. We also have a personal financial management company that we work with called Seedly, which you may have heard of. And we also have a SaaS offering, which is more of a B2B2C offering, which deals primarily with connecting influencers and creators with financial institutions and allowing them to monetize their content. So that's kind of an up-and-coming business that we started a couple of years ago. Is doing wonderfully well. It's an exciting place to be. We are, along with our customers, though highly regulated. We are a regulated entity ourselves. And so it makes us particularly sensitive to security and particularly sensitive to data privacy.
Yep. Awesome. So I think that probably leads us to my next question. As a regulated fintech, security is very important. So how has security changed for you as Hyphen Group has scaled?
That's a very good question. It's hard to answer in a simple way, but I don't know that it's changed so much as we scaled, but our appetite for risk has changed. In other words, I think that we started out quite risk averse. And we moved from there to a model where we understood that our ability to add value to our customers was enhanced by our ability to have more data about our customers so that we could personalize their journeys and create more tailored experiences for them. To do that, you need data. And so we started down the route of assuming that that we needed to collect sensitive data, but that we would not do it in a way that ever threatened the security or the privacy of our customers or our partners. And so one of the things that you have to do as especially a startup is you have to be deliberate about things like your organizational plans, how you hire, how you build frameworks. Most importantly, how do you create an environment where you are not bureaucratic, where you do not stop your developers and your engineers from actually building great things? How do you build a culture where communication is one of the underpinnings of that? And how do you maintain sort of a two-speed philosophy where one speed is the speed of going as fast as you can to develop your products? We have over 50 releases per week. We have 125 million events per day that we capture. We have a lot of data. To make a mistake at that scale is unforgivable. And so what we do very deliberately is we build security in from the bottom up.
Awesome.
So top from the outside in and from the inside out, you have to have security all the way. And if you do it deliberately, then the entire culture becomes sensitized to the need to do that, but it also becomes non-optional. It becomes something that you don't have to think about as much because you know that the controls are there. You know that how you deploy, how you manage, how you operate, how you protect, how you detect are all part of the DNA of what you're building. And if you do it that way, it's a little bit less friction. And I think for me, that is how you scale. It's less around the technologies that you choose and more around the culture that you build.
Absolutely. So I think data is probably the biggest organizational asset. So how have you actually looked at securing data as you've grown and scaled in terms of data protection?
Another really good question, and not one that is simple to answer, but how we approach data protection is, first of all, be aware of what you have. So observability, visibility of what you have, and what risks you have. What are the risk vectors? How can people possibly get to you? Assume that there's a bad guy in the room with you. Assume that you've already been breached. Assume that somebody's already there. But also take the necessary measure to try to keep them out. So you don't not have a lock just because you assume that the burglar's in the house. You also have a lock, just in case.
Yeah.
So you do a little bit of both. It's called defense in depth strategy, and it's using a combination of zero trust authorization and zero trust security, along with this defense in depth strategy. So you have your observability, that's first. Your second is your ability to take that data that you're collecting, the visibility of what you have out there, and actually taking action against it. If you have the best detective controls on the planet and you do nothing about it, then it doesn't matter. I've been in organizations before where you'd have 20 to 30,000 events per month. And if you don't have this culture of automatically taking it and putting it into somebody's backlog to deal with it, it's almost useless. So do that first. Second is sort of build this culture of automation. Now, what you will end up with is if you don't automate, what you're going to end up with is bureaucracy. You will end up with checklists. You will end up with compliance. You will end up with audit. None of those are bad things, but if you rely on those things to protect you, it's too late. It's reactive. So you have to build it up front. And so then that comes into data protection is about what data am I holding, how visible is it to me, then who has access to it, who should have access to it, and how do I prevent those that shouldn't have access to it to make sure that they don't have access to it. So it sounds simplistic when you say it, but it's actually quite difficult. For instance, if you think about a typical development project may use a service account to link to a database and using that database's encryption technology. And you can check the list, you say, yes, I'm encrypted, but it's actually not that useful.
Sure.
So what is useful is being able to tie that encryption, that row of data, to the person that owns it. That's where data protection really changes for you. I think that's about all. There's probably more to talk about, but I think you're getting into more of the detective and preventive aspect
So
of
like
things.
my next question was around that, right? So you spoke a little bit about detection, about automation. So maybe can you tell us how you detect and respond to your threats against your applications as well as your infrastructure?
Well, it's funny that I love the way you said that. Threats against your infrastructure. I don't think you have threats against your infrastructure. I think that people use your infrastructure to get to your data, when they use your applications to get to your data, but the threat is always to your data.
Absolutely.
So threat to my applications would be if I were to allow an engineer to slip, and it would never happen, but if somebody were to slip something malicious into code and have that deployed and then therefore create a backdoor or some way for somebody to get access to the data, that is, to me, more of the application level prevention that you want to do. But you start with detective controls. And I know I've just said a lot about being, proactive, but detective controls, you need to start with that reactive capability. At the end of everything else, you have to assume that all of your controls will fail. And so you have to be able to detect problems. So you detect the problems first. So you build as robust of an environment around detective controls as you can, and you put them into an area where people can't see them. In other words, only security team, only authorized users can see that part of your environment. And you pay attention. And then over time, you build preventive controls. Now, those preventive controls can be everything from source code scanning, can be actual patterns that you use to ensure that when you deploy onto infrastructure as code, that that pattern is solid. You also make sure that you have the preventive controls around making sure that, for instance, if you have an IP address and you only need to access port 443 or port 80, just open those. Don't open anything else. So it's not the world anymore where you have everything open and then you have to close it. You start with just opening and allowing the things that you want to be accessed in the way you need to do it. And then you layer controls on top of that. So that to me is how you kind of preserve that automation environment using both detective and preventive controls.
Okay, very cool. I think another thing that we've also spoken about a lot is, what do you call cattle? How do you call pets, and what are cattle within your environment?
Yeah, as a person that worked on a ranch for a long part of my life, I've always liked cows. So I would treat them as pets if I could, but the reality is everything in our environment is really cattle in this context. Oddly enough, we have a few pets, and those pets tend to be old-fashioned security software.
We talk about this, yes.
That can't actually scale and be as robust as the regular part of the infrastructure. So in a way, we're a little bit ahead of the curve. It's hard to find partners and security software providers that give us the kind of scalability and manageability that we actually need in that kind of environment. So those get treated like pets, but we're trying to eliminate them as fast as we can. So if you don't mind, I thought of another thing that I wanted to talk about in this context, which is it's a little bit related to the idea of the security culture, but it's really around this two-speed IT.
Okay.
The reason I think it's important that we bring this up is that as a regulated entity, you have to be sensitive and empathetic to the needs of your regulators. And I use those words deliberately, empathy rather than treating it as an obligation. You are empathetic to the needs of your partners, you're empathetic to the needs of the regulators because they have a job which encompasses all types of enterprises, all types of institutions, and they are not going to make allowances just because you're small. And they shouldn't, right? So you have to have the ability to have your automation and your controls produce the level of evidence that they expect and that they demand over any kind of enterprise, which means that the burden on a small and scaling company is that you either take everybody on a fire drill to produce documentation or you build it into your controls to produce the kind of audit evidence that is required to make your partners and your regulators comfortable that you know what you're doing. And then you have to practice translating what you do into what they understand. If you begin to be sort of obstinate about it and say, well, that doesn't make sense for me, you will miss the point. The point is that everybody has to comply to these rules. It is our obligation and our social contract to protect our customers' data. And the way we do that is by asserting through trusted third parties that we are who we say we are. So that's a key part of this contract is you have that speed while supporting the 50 releases a week, while doing all the automation. And so you have to be ready to translate what you do into what others can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, you have a wealth of experience. So obviously you've grown Hyphen, you've worked in multiple different areas. What is one thing that you would say, and how would you help other companies think about security, and what other best practices you would tell people to do that you wish you implemented sooner?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I had to go back in time, I would say I only was qualified to work at Hyphen in the context of a scaling startup because I had already worked for scaled enterprises. So I learned a lot of the lessons about what not to do. And I learned a lot of the lessons about what it means to operate at scale. And I came into Hyphen with the thought that if we come here and we start small, And we make things like security not a process of getting approvals, not a process of going through a checklist, but making sure that when I deploy this database, it is by default secure. And make it non-optional. You simply can't do it if you don't do that. So if you start small and start at that basis, you don't have to refactor, you don't have to rebuild, you don't have to do things as you get bigger. The tendency that every company has is as they grow, they tend to think, well, I need to chase revenue. There's no real business value in doing this security stuff. And so why not just, maybe we don't need it. Our firewalls are really good. We've got really good perimeter controls. And so maybe we'll just skip it for this. No, don't do that. Build it in so that you can't notice it and you have no choice. And so that's going back to the detective and preventive controls. I have a team whose job it is to create and manage detective controls, and that's what they do for a living. But everybody is responsible for preventive controls. So there's always somebody watching to make sure something doesn't go wrong. And you assume that it's not an ill intent, but even a mistake can be disastrous, right? So you want to make it so people can go fast, can learn from others, can deploy things quickly, can build things wonderfully, but there's always somebody watching.
Yeah.
So I think that's one. Second part is there is a